I think, as might have been guessed from what I said to Toni Collette, I found this absolutely terrifying. And I did see it over a week ago. And there are still images from this film that keep coming back. Just in moments, if I look into a dark corner, I'll suddenly see something. But I mean, I have to say, I think fear is subjective. So I'm not going to make some wide statement and say that everyone on the planet is going to be absolutely terrified by this, because I think it's always dependent on your own personal fears. My personal fears revolve a lot around sleep paralysis, which is when you wake up in the middle of the night, but your body's frozen and your mind starts going crazy. And so all the sort of paranormal things that fly off that is what I really, really gets me. And I think Hereditary does kind of tap into that type of fear. So I can say for me, it was incredibly effective. And I think as well, Hereditary really made me think about the nature of horror and what we're looking for when we make horror films, because I think the impulse for a lot of filmmakers is to try and dig into our nightmares, like what's the most nightmarish thing that you can put up on screen. But I feel like Hereditary is more about that physical and emotional feeling of when you're having a paranormal experience. I'll put that in air quotes. It's that feeling of dread and uncertainty, but also mixed with a little bit of hesitation about, what is reality? What am I seeing? Is that chair with a coat over it in the corner of the room actually a chair with a coat over it? Or is it something else and something much, much worse? And I think what's interesting as well is that it doesn't play all its horror cards at once. It really holds on to them until, I think, very near the end of the film. And I think it's all the more effective for that because it waits until you are absolutely immersed, until just unleashing it. And there is a climactic sequence in that film that I, for a moment, thought was too much. I had a moment during this film that I just wanted to go, can I tap out now? Can you just pause the film? Can I go outside for a bit, look at the sunshine, and then we can continue? Because I found it a little bit overwhelming, and it's not to do anything with guts or gore. It's just pure tension. And I think this film really understands how the very careful manipulation of tension can turn what is a rather unassuming image into a shot of pure terror. And that, in a way, reminds me of some of my favorite shots in horror, like the really infamous scene in the diner from Mulholland Drive with the guy around the back.
Why did you bring that up?
I'm sorry. But also the shot in The Shining of the interrupted man in the bear costume.
Oh, great. Now I'm not sleeping tonight.
Exactly. But that's the kind of horror that Hereditary really reminded me of. And I think it is also a film that carefully curates from all the horror greats. So you get that love of wide-angled shots from The Shining. You get the sense of paranoia from Rosemary's Baby. And to kind of flip things forward, you also get a love of the stillness from It Follows. You know how still and quiet that film is.
Yeah.
And also, Toni Collette mentioned, I can only say her full name, Toni Collette.
Yeah.
Mentioned the score from Colin.
Tony.
Yeah.
Doesn't sound
Tony.
right.
The score from Colin Stetson that she mentioned is spectacular because it's so unnerving just on its own. I haven't tried to listen to it on its own, but I feel like it would be, so that's why I haven't. And something that's slightly different from a trend I've seen in a lot of horror films recently is that there's no real clean-cut metaphor here. It's not like The Babadook, where the thing is a manifestation of depression or grief or alienation. I think the ghosts in this film are just ghosts, and the subtext comes from how the characters react to that. And so I think it's a very complicated depiction of grief. You have Annie, Toni Collette's character, who is estranged from her mother, and she has this sense of unease about that grief that really carries on into the atmosphere of the film. And it's that feeling of where grief and guilt intersect, where you either feel guilty for not grieving enough, or you feel like guilty that you might somehow be responsible in some way. And obviously she is also just an absolutely gut-wrenching performance. And I think, as she mentions, it's not just the horror of things that go bump in the night. It's the horror of seeing your entire family crumble in front of your eyes. And she has this nature to her where she doesn't really let things out unless it's in that outburst of emotion that we see in that scene that we played, or she has fits of sleepwalking, or in her art, those little miniatures where it's a way to kind of take all the anxieties and fears of her family and just to compress them into these little as miniature and aestheticized versions of it so that she could kind of lock everything away for the meantime. And so I think all that emotional complexity just adds to the horror. There's the secrecy and the guilt and the anguish, and it's a film that lingers. That's the best thing I can say about it, is that it really lingers, and I'm looking forward to the day when I can look at a dark corner and not feel nervous again, if that ever comes.